ushered in.
Okay.
Feel good?
I feel great.
Excellent.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for your participation today in the activities. I hope you've been to some great panels, that your papers have went well, and that's been a great morning. Today, or right now, we're going to have our keynote session over lunch, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Father Charles Gallagher, an associate professor of history at Boston College. A specialist in the history of papal diplomacy, intelligence history, and the Holocaust, Father Gallagher's research has advanced our knowledge of the remarkable intersections of spycraft, international relations, and theology. He earned his PhD from Marquette University in 1998, after time at St. Anselm's College, a member of the Benedictine Cassidine congregation, to which Belmont Abbey is a member. He has held fellowships at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. His 2008 book, Vatican Secret Diplomacy, Joseph Hurley and Pope Pius XII from Yale University Press, won the John Gilmary Shea Prize from the American Catholic Historical Association. His most recent book, and the subject of his talk today, is Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten History of the Christian Front, from Harvard University Press. It's quite a read. It explores a largely unknown chapter of World War II that brings together theology, spycraft, government surveillance, and sedition. This book has already received notable attention and has been nominated for the prestigious Braumeier Award in Religion from the University of Louisville and Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. In addition to these and many other accomplishments, Father Gallagher is also a member of Phi Alpha Theta, initiated into the Kappa Omega chapter at the College of Holy Cross. Please join me in welcoming Father Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a real pleasure to be here at Belmont Abbey, which gave my alma mater, Marquette, their best basketball coach ever, Al McGuire. I want to start out by thanking a few people. I'd like to thank Daniel for his hospitality. As I mentioned earlier, the Benedictine order is known for their hospitality. That comes right from the rule of St. Benedict, and it's really been evident to me in the last hours since I arrived. I'd also like to thank Dr. Patrick Wadden, the chair of the history department here at Belmont Abbey, for having me, Dr. Troy Fay, who's accompanied us to dinner last night, with Emily Davis of the history department, and also Dr. Clay Dries of Virginia Wesleyan, who's here representing National. Thank you very much for your presence with us today. I want to move right on. This is basically, it's basically Christians with machine guns and spies, Nazis, commies, and basically when I was writing this book, there were so many jaw droppers in each chapter that I just had to keep rolling with it. And it all started when I was at Marquette University, and when I was your age, and I wanted to do a research paper for National Security History class, and I wanted to research this priest, and I'm going to see if we can bring up a little audio here to start. His name is Father Charles Coughlin, and he was a Catholic priest in the 1930s who was very famous on the radio. He had 30 million listeners on the radio every week, and I'm just going to run through one of his speeches here. He's speaking in Chicago, and I don't know if let me see if the audio is going to be able to go. As he runs through his speech here, he's talking to the listeners in, I think it's what would become Cub Stadium. He's telling them to, you can see his gesticulations, and at the end here, he'll tell them to form their battalions, take up the sword of truth, and and get rid of politicians, basically, he was saying. I do not preach like that. Yeah, form your battalions. Again, I do not deliver my Sunday homilies in such, with such vigor. So I was interested in this because when I was cleaning out my grandfather's house, or my father's house in the basement, I found my grandfather's scrapbook from the 1930s. This is back when I was your age again. I think I was in grad school at that point. And my grandfather had a scrapbook. You know, 1930s, a scrapbook is kind of tantamount to what Facebook is today. And he had a lot of coverage of Catholic things, and one of them was of an FBI raid on the headquarters of Father Coughlin's group called the Christian Front. And I'd never heard of the group before, but the AP press coverage talked about the FBI agents swooping down and uncovering a cache of weapons, homemade bombs, ammunition. And during that period when I was, and so one of the photographs that I saw was this. And this basically jogged my imagination. And I couldn't, so when I searched further, it comes to find out that these are Roman Catholic men who are charged with sedition, the violent overthrow of the US government in 1940. And when I was your age, I saw this picture, and so I went in. You know how you always have to write a 10-page paper at the end of the semester class? So I went into my professor of national security history, and I said, I'd like to write a 10-page paper on these guys that I saw with rifles who are talking about Jesus and calling themselves Catholic, and I'd like to kind of get to the bottom of that. And my professor forbade me from writing the paper because he knew about the case. And he said, no, and this was the whole thing. He said, there's nothing there. There's nothing to see there. You're not going to be able to find anything. It was a political prosecution. Nothing mattered about it. And please just find another topic, right? So the other thing was, my summer job in college was training as a police officer in my local hometown police force. And as a summer cop, you do after my third year, they started training me on semi-automatic weaponry. I think today I'm still the only Jesuit trained in a single pump Remington 970 shotgun. But we'll let that go. So when I saw these guys, I was like, those are Springfield M1903 rifles. And I can't, they shoot a 30-06 round. That's like a 3-inch round with a full metal jacket. That'll go through a brick wall, and it's a five clip in the breech loading rifle. And I was like, those are weapons of war. And so I was kind of like, these guys are really interesting to me because apparently they want to overthrow the government, and they're armed to the teeth. And that echo came back of my professor saying, there's nothing there. And I kept saying to myself, there's got to be something here. So I think for the presenters here today and the students of Phi Alpha Theta, if you have a hunch and you can figure it out, go for it. Just keep digging and keep going. And if it jazzes you up and you think there's something there, don't take no for an answer. Because basically what ended up happening was this book, which we will give away at the end of this session. We're going to have a book giveaway, kind of like a raffle thing. We're going to get the attendance sheet, and then I'm going to point the laser at it, and somebody will win the book. So this is kind of how it goes. These guys were, and they're all men. The FBI had a plant inside the group. because what happened was most of them were in the New York National Guard. And a member of the they approached two men to try to train them in a Browning light machine gun in order to work a Browning light machine gun, which is a 30 caliber weapon which shoots about 300 rounds a minute. And so the first person just declined to do it, and then the second person from the New York National Guard said that they would train them on how to use the machine guns, and then he went straight to the FBI and said, listen, these guys in my New York National Guard unit asked me to train them on a Browning light machine gun because they call themselves patriotic and anti-communist. So the guy went right to the FBI, and the FBI used him as a plant, but then started to pay him exorbitant amounts of money, which meant his testimony in court wouldn't hold later on. In any event, what happens is, oh gosh, here we go. So here they are. The leader, John Cassidy, in New York. It starts in New York. They all follow Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin's, there's a public-facing group called the Christian Front. Then there are these guys with their rifles, and they are called the Action Committee. So they're kind of the paramilitarized cells, and they want to kill communists and Jews because they feel that communists and Jews have infiltrated the American government, and that they're one and the same, so they're synonymous. So they want to expunge America from the Jewish contagion, in their view, and that they are going to start a false flag event. They're going to detonate bombs throughout New York City and blame it on the Communist Party. And they see communists and Jews as the same. And then when Governor Lehman calls out the National Guard, their paramilitary groups are going to rise up alongside the National Guardsmen and point them into the direction to put down the revolt, and thereby indicate that they are the true leaders of the suppression of this government takeover, and that they will be the true patriots in this scenario, leading them to expel these revolutionaries from the American system. One jaw dropper was how they got their weapons. There was a codicil in the Army Code from 1903, which indicated that if you were a member of the National Rifle Association, you could write to the Department of War, Civilian Marksmanship Division, and have military-grade weaponry shipped to your local armory, and for an extra $1.35, it could be shipped to your doorstep. So the M1903s that they have, and all of the M30-06 ammunition, and also cordite, which they used to make bombs, because they were members of the National Rifle Association, all that could be shipped to their house for about $10. And that's how they were going to lead their, and it was totally legal. I gave a book talk in New Hampshire, and at the Q&A, it was kind of silent, nobody had a question, and someone raised their hand and said, oh, Father Gallagher, by the way, is that loophole still open? I was like, to put your minds at ease, the Clinton administration in 1996 shut down the civilian Department of Civilian Marksmanship weapon postage operation. So then, this is, okay, so there was one FBI report. Now, these guys are all motivated by religion as well as paramilitarism, and I call it paramilitary anti-Semitism. They really hate Jews, and they want to eradicate Jews. And so, consequently, we had papers on the Holocaust this morning. It's that same vibe And it's present in the United States here in the 1940s, and that's kind of what the book brings out. There was one FBI report where they went to target practice, and they would read the Talmud before they started their target practice because they wanted to know their enemy. Then on Sunday mornings, they would get up at 6 a.m., do military rushes and target practice, break at 9 a.m., go to church, and then come back at 11 a.m. and start target practice again. Now, like, I found that really fascinating in a macabre way, but I couldn't think, like, why isn't anybody interested in these people? They're, I find that whole system to be, oh, sorry. I think okay. Well, we moved past the theologians here for some reason. Hold on. Oh, boy. Okay. Maybe I'll just use the computer. Yeah. Okay, so there they are. So this is what I wanted to do. What I saw in all this was basically the way the historians who have written about the group in the past, they treated them as basically from a position of politics only, and they positioned them as anti-communists only. And I thought that was cutting it short, because in my view, they called themselves the Christian Front. And I thought, well, what they're doing is manipulating Christianity towards paramilitarism. And that's what I really set out to find. I just said to myself, those guys with rifles don't end up doing that for political reasons, and what I mean by that is electoral politics. There's got to be some other motivating factor. And so that's what this book was about. And I said, I need to engage the theological context. And so because of my study of history, I knew that in the 1930s, there were two dominant theologies that were present then that are no longer extant today. And they were called mystical body of Christ theology, which was based in St. Paul, the body to the head, the part to the whole. And for them, their grievance claims to take up those weapons, I argue in the book, was because they felt that Catholics were being persecuted by communists, read Jews, in Mexico in the 1920s, where there was a communist, socialist, but they saw socialists as communists. So there was a revolution in Mexico in the 1920s where Catholics were displaced and in their view, and persecuted, and there was the Spanish Civil War in the mid-1930s where they saw it as a religious war. And for example, 10% of the diocesan priests in the Archdiocese of Madrid were executed by firing squad. They saw that as a persecution by communists, which they read as Jews. Jews equal communists, communists equal Jews. They said, if it's all right for communists to take up arms, then it should be okay for Catholics to take up arms. They did this because also in 1922, Pius XI started this program called Catholic Action, which was kind of a Catholic social uplift movement based largely in charity. But by the mid-1930s, it turned into an anti-communist movement in its main impulse. And then Judeo-Bolshevism is that equation of Jews with communism. So that's where they are. And in the middle of the mix is this Father Coughlin. He's on the radio. He's got 30 million listeners. Keep in mind, there's only 132 million people in the US in 1940. So 1/5 of the population is listening to him. This is before computers and television. 1/5 of the population is listening to him on the radio, kind of hold forth. So these are our, just to use a laser, these are the bomb-making materials that they had. They had squib fuses, and they were making canister bombs. And one of the more difficult passages in my book was because for 75 years historians completely poo-pooed this group. They said it, at the time the journalists called it a playful plot, and that these men were crackpots, and they never amounted to anything that would be threatening to the US government. I saw it otherwise, mainly because of my law enforcement background. I saw what they were using, and one of the more painful parts of writing the book from a moral perspective for me was the FBI file, which everyone said never existed, and I was able to ferret that out. There is a verbatim of how to make a pipe bomb. And it's rather chilling. And for me, morally, it was difficult to put that section in the book, but I showed it to another priest, an African theologian named Marcel Unizewa, who's now in Kenya. He told me, his eyes like widened. He said, "You cannot publish this because it's so descriptive." And I thought, oh, here I am with the anarchist cookbook problem, you know. But I thought that that because historians and others had just dismissed this group so much, I actually decided to put it in. I won't put it in any of my public presentations because I think it's too lethal, but it's there in the book. And because these are the sorts of things they are caching in their basements in Brooklyn, and they're trying to overthrow the U.S. government from Brooklyn. This is a shout out to the medievalists today. I know we had some medievalists. Loving on the medievalists. This is basically how they justify theologically their point of view in getting rid of President Roosevelt. St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica argues that it is morally permissible for the subject to depose their ruler if the rulers are tyrannical, but it is against the moral code to engage in sedition, which is the violent overthrow of the government. So that's why I have deponere si, seditio no, right? So that's my own take on Latin. Father Finbar, the Benedictine father I had at St. A's, might be happy with that translation. So this is the leader in Boston basically saying this to his members, and this is the day after Pearl Harbor. He's saying that it's permissible for us to use violence to overthrow the tyranny of the Roosevelt administration, who brought us into World War II and declared war on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, right? So he's saying we can overthrow by force of violence, if necessary, any administration that is trying to bestow tyranny upon us. So it's just a little theological. And then this is the guy who's the leader of the group in New York. Again, these are people that no one knows about. Nobody's written anything about them. They're street level people. That's the other thing I kind of liked about this project was you're not dealing with elites. My last book was on Vatican diplomacy, so I was writing a lot about bishops, cardinals, diplomats, highfalutin, well-educated people. These are people you meet in your neighborhood at the street level. In some ways, I think it's more important to figure out who they are. This is John F. Cassidy. He's a graduate of St. John's Law School. Couldn't figure out what to do with his life because he took 3 times and still couldn't pass the bar. So he became involved with Father Coughlin and became his lieutenant in New York. And then as we see here, Coughlin, using the technology of the day, over shortwave radio, basically gives the blessing to Cassidy over the radio, blessings of Almighty God, making him his lieutenant in New York, and he's leading the paramilitary wing in New York. Now keep in mind, the members of the organization who follow Father Coughlin, there's about 100,000 members. They don't know that there are these paramilitary cells. Only Cassidy knows, and the other few men that he recruits to do the paramilitary work. So he gets the blessings of Almighty God. So again, more religion. And I'm using this throughout the book. When I see religion pop up, I show its correlation to the paramilitarism and trying to show this as the motivation. That's a slide we've already been through. I think I just went too fast on that one. These are the machine guns that they were stealing from. They stole one of these from the Natick Armory in Boston, a Browning light machine gun, Waltham Armory, I'm sorry. The FBI covered it up. That's why we don't know about it. The FBI and the Massachusetts National Guard covered the whole thing up. And that comes out in the FBI documents. They were put on trial for sedition in 1940 and got acquitted. And John Cassidy, because he got his rifles through the War Department, went right up to the judge right after the acquittal and asked for his guns back. So they're found not guilty. Actually, they're nolo prost, which is different from being not guilty, but they're not exactly exonerated. But Father Coughlin and others celebrate it. But then what happens is they get shut down in New York because of the notoriety of the trial, and everybody knows about them now in New York. What happens is it moves to Boston, where in 1938, this gentleman here, again, who nobody knows about, nobody's really written anything about, Herbert Scholz, is the German Consul. He's sent there to be the German Consul in the fall of 1938. And he is from Karlsruhe in Germany and Munich. He's the scion of a manufacturing magnate in Munich that made rail cars. And in an act of rebellion against his father, he joins the Sturmabteilung, the SA, and his mentor becomes Ernst Röhm, who with Adolf Hitler founded the SA, the Brown Shirts. In the book, there's a very dramatic portrayal of the tussle that goes on between Röhm and Himmler to poach Scholz from the SA to the SS. You can read about that in the book. It's really dramatic, and it takes place within the context of the Night of the Long Knives. Prior to that, Scholz left Munich and went to Leipzig and got a PhD in psychology, and then was assigned to work in the Brown House, the Nazi Party headquarters, under Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. Most people don't know this, but Hess was the intelligence chief for the Nazi Party, and it was Hess who trained Scholz in spycraft. These are the people in his neighborhood. These are the people he ended up working for Hess in the Brown House, so these were the people that he would meet in his office as he went to work every day. He's assigned to Boston in 1938. Everyone in the press thought it was a demotion. He was sent to Washington from the embassy in Washington, where he was cultural attaché, to Boston. Everyone said, well, that's a demotion, but in fact, what was happening was Heinrich Brüning, who was the Chancellor of Germany during Weimar, the longest-serving chancellor, not the immediate predecessor of Hitler, but the longest-serving chancellor, he was living in Boston. He was teaching the political science department at Harvard. And after Kristallnacht in 1938, he decided to give anti-Hitler speeches. And immediately, Himmler and Hitler heard about that. So they sent Scholz as a heavy to clamp down on Brüning. And you can read about the intimidation campaign that Scholz ran against Brüning, which shut him up and ended up in one of Brüning's conspirators being murdered during the July, and the aftermath of the July 1944 plot. Again, it's all stuff like nobody put these pieces together before. It's really kind of chilling stuff. When it gets to Boston, they meet this guy, who's the equivalent of Cassidy in New York. This is Father Coughlin's other foot soldier, a guy named Francis P. Moran. Again, working class individual, comes from a family of 10 Irish American immigrants. He's a dropout of the Franciscans. You can't blame the Benedictines for him. He tried to study for the Franciscans, and then right before he was going to take his religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, he dropped out of the seminary, most likely because of the celibacy rule, which I always say, fair enough. And so he drops out and he goes back to Boston, and he becomes an insurance salesman. And he draws closer, he becomes basically Father Coughlin's political organizer in Boston, and he becomes closer to Coughlin's anti-Semitism. And by 1937 and 38, he's the main organizer for the Christian Front in Boston, and he's extremely charismatic. He's an excellent organizer. He's an amazing public speaker, and membership starts ticking upward. Oh, gosh. All right. Let me go back here. I'm going to use this. This is where the title of the book, From Nazis of Copley Square, because when Scholz comes to Boston, he meets with Moran and starts paying for him to have his headquarters in a suite of rooms at the Copley Square Hotel. And that's how you get the title of the book, Nazis of Copley Square. Copley Square Hotel, it's the main square in Boston. Here is Scholz with his wife, Lilo von Schnitzler, whose father is the commercial attaché of IG Farben and the largest single donor to the Nazi Party in 1932 when they needed the money most. He's a very handsome man. They call him Handsome Herbert, very charming on the diplomatic scene, both in Boston and in Washington. He had 2 children. Well, it's interesting. In Boston, Lilo had to leave, and he was only there for 3 years. 2.5 of those 3 years, his wife was over in Germany giving birth to their sons because as an SS officer, the children of an SS officer always had to be born in Germany. So she was away, and the State Department's intelligence unit probably had the best intelligence on him, but all they were able to record were his amorous liaisons with various mistresses. And so they knew nothing about his spying, but everything about his romance, which didn't help me in the book very much. There he is in the consulate in Boston under the portrait of Hitler, and then there is his SS officer's cap. I cannot find a picture of him in his uniform except for his wedding photo when he married Lilo, but the contact who had that photo wouldn't let me use it. He was an energetic spy in Boston. Sorry. This is the Boston Consulate in the spring of 1940. That's rather chilling. That's 2 blocks from the State House in Boston. This is an operation that he ran with Moran, where he publicly tried to persuade Congress to adopt this rifle, which is known as the Johnson semi-automatic rifle, as the main battle weapon for the U.S. Army over the M1 Garand, because in the spring and summer of 1940, Congress was deliberating which rifle to adopt. And that flag in front of the consulate in Boston was flying because the Nazis had just invaded the Low Countries, Holland and Sweden in the Low Countries in the spring of 1940, and the Dutch were the largest single buyer of the Johnson semi-automatic, and they had 30,000 Johnson semi-automatics when the Nazis rolled through the Netherlands. And it sounds strange to our ears, but the Germans they couldn't steal through their espionage the specs for the M1 Garand, particularly the gas mechanism. And it also sounds strange to our ears, the Germans couldn't build a good semi-automatic rifle. And so they wanted to steal the specs to any of them. And they had the Johnsons. So that's what they wanted the Americans to adopt the Johnson rifle because they already had it. They could not only reverse engineer it, but engineer it to outgun whatever the Americans, if the Americans adopted it. So there was this public, Scholz and Moran, who start meeting secretly in July of 1940, they work out this public program of speeches, letters to the editors, picketing, public events to try to get Congress to adopt the Johnson rifle. Eventually, the M1 Garand is adopted, but it's a rather wild situation. My point is that this is a religious organization, right? And Joseph Nye at Harvard has written years about soft power, which means basically religion is about number 5 on the rung of priorities for anything meaningful in World War II. So what I wanted to do in this book was show, no, this is a religious organization. It's pumping up a battlefield rifle debate. And whoever adopts that rifle is going to have an advantage on the battlefield. And this is a religious question. And that's basically how I wanted to do it. So that's what I did. I think this will come along. Yeah. So this is one piece of, like, how lethal was Shoals. This is a slide about Hugh Clegg, who's an assistant director of the FBI. He recruits a contact in Washington that indicates that he knows Shoals and has been asked to meet with him on a monthly basis. And Clegg sends this information to the FBI director, Hoover, and Hoover says, please develop this contact. When Clegg tries to develop it, the contact backs out, saying that he thinks that Shoals will kill him if he ever finds out that he's talking with the FBI. And I think that's true, given Shoals' lethality quotient. This guy is a guy no one else has ever heard of, Fritz Fenthal. That's menthol with an F. So he took a trip in the spring of 1940 from Munich and Berlin to China, Russia, and Japan, and then came to Boston and met with Shoals for 4 days. And it was after that meeting that Shoals begins his infiltration of US military camps in Massachusetts and naval operations in Massachusetts. You can read with Moran. So what he does is he has Moran. Now Moran is his agent now. By July of 1940, we know that Moran has become his agent. And that was the other puzzle for me in this book. The big question on that is what allows or permits a Roman Catholic organizer to morally work with a Nazi SS officer? That's kind of interesting to me. So he's a full agent now, and Moran goes around and he goes into Fort Devens, and he goes into Camp Edwards, which is the largest training camp on the East Coast, other than Florida, Camp Landing. And he gives religious talks, and they're morale-busting talks, and then he goes back and he reports about the camps to Shoals, like gives him data about the structure of the camp, which the Germans don't have. So he gets there because he tells the camp authorities, I'm going to go like give a religious discussion during Lent. And he does that, and then he goes back and he reports everything that he finds, because the Americans aren't going to let a German consul into any of these camps, but Moran goes in under the guise of religious talks. This is just these are some stats about what's going on with the Christian Front. In New England, it has a membership of about 30,000. That's down from its heyday in New York, but it's still a significant number. And keep in mind, no one knows that Moran is working with Shoals. No one knew that Moran was working with Shoals until the book was published last September. There's clergy participation, and then interestingly enough, there are 4 federal intelligence agencies surveilling the Christian Front. And not one of those intelligence agencies were ever able to discover that Moran was an agent of Shoals. Your tax money at work. The other thing too is it has, in my view, it has also, you got to see the flip side, has pretty chilling consequences for the First Amendment. Right now before the Supreme Court, there's Fawaz v. U.S. about the Muslim mosques in California and FBI surveillance. These folks would argue, well, we're a religious organization, why is the FBI infiltrating our meetings? And they were holding bi-monthly meetings, standing room only. What happened was, I want to conclude pretty quickly here, there's always a Jesuit involved. So after the New York trial broke up, later that summer, this Jesuit from Boston College, he had a radio show which was piped coast to coast from Maine to Connecticut, southern Connecticut. Michael J. Ahern gave a 1-hour speech indicating that it was now morally permissible for Christians in New York and New England to rejoin the Christian Front. And William Stevenson, who some say Ian Fleming used as the model for James Bond, he was running the British passport control in New York, which was basically the spy nest for British intelligence in Rockefeller Center. Stevenson got wind of Ahearn's speech, and then they checked the numbers and saw that Christian Front membership was skyrocketing in the summer of 1940. And what they decided to do, and this is another jaw-dropper, Stevenson gave the okay for British intelligence to run a front organization on American soil, targeting Americans entirely illegally in the spring and summer of 1941. And what they decided to do was to go in at the ground level and create a neighborhood organization, which they called the Irish American Defense Association. They used a cutout, which is an American that's working for British intelligence, who presents himself as an American, and to recruit a leader of that group. I think I know who the cutout is. One is a rather innocuous name. The other has a foundation with a slew of lawyers who could sue me if I wrote about him in my book, so I didn't do that. And it's a name you would know. So the cutout convinced this woman. Oh, this is how they did it. I want to show you that before we get to the target of that recruitment. These are some of the secret files from the SOE, Special Operations Executive, which is Churchill's private subversive warfare unit. The original documents that were created by Political Warfare Executive, they're destroyed. So I'm using mainly copies from SOE. Stevenson was such a megalomaniac. The only reason we know about this because Stevenson was a megalomaniac and sent all copies of all his reports to Churchill because he always wanted a promotion, right? and to show Churchill just what a great job he was doing. But all the other stuff, all the original stuff was destroyed. And this is another note to students. Anything that's really, really secret is always filed under miscellaneous. So then you got a lot. So this is their telegram. These are all code names. I was able to figure out who the code names were. You can read that. And so it's basically, these are their bullet points. But what we're going to do is set up a front organization, Irish kind of defense organization, run it at the neighborhood level. We're going to put a group together and have it run by an American. And they're even going to think about using Irish communists because about a month earlier, Operation Barbarossa had started. So now the communists, the Soviets, who were in a pact, pretty healthy handshake with Hitler, now they're all of a sudden not, they're on the side of the Allies. And this is from you. I took about 2 years trying to figure out who you was with a couple of different intelligence historians from Britain, and I figured out who he was, and you can read about that in the book. So these are all the, it's pretty big name actually, Alexander Cadogan. And that's kind of cool. Doing the spy hunting is really kind of cool. I thought it was kind of fun. This is the recruit that the cutout recruited, a woman reporter from Boston. She was kind of, this magazine, it's kind of a newspaper. It was kind of a bi-monthly. It was a tiny, tiny little sheet. But she was civil rights minded and human rights minded before that was cool. And she was a devout Catholic. As Moran, who was working with the SS officer, he would say, self-identify, he'd say, I'm a devout Catholic too. She, though, is kind of foreshadowing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, and she believes in her heart that Catholic anti-Semitism is a sin. And so that's why she decides to work unwittingly with the cutout. So she starts working for British intelligence, even though she doesn't know she's working for British intelligence. I gave a talk at Harvard at the Belfair Center to their intelligence project. I had to do it over Zoom, and they couldn't show me who was in the audience. It was kind of weird, right? Like, I was speaking, but I couldn't see them because it was the intelligence project. It was kind of, so then someone had a question. It was, I think it was a general officer with a British accent, and she says, how do you know that she was really a spy for the British? like kind of crestfallen, like, how can you prove it? And I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, we have the pay stubs. You know? Which means she's breaking the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And this is the moral ambiguity, the same way that Francis Moran is breaking the Foreign Agents Registration Act, working with Scholes. And the Foreign Agents Registration Act got popular with Paul Manafort and General Flynn recently, right? It's the same law. This is when I knew I had a book. You know, there's a point where you got like, oh, I got an article. And when I uncovered like this is an original letter from Francis Sweeney in the secret files in Britain from Boston, I was like, oh, I think it's a book now, right? Because now you know that, you know, when you can marry those documents from my hometown in Boston to the secret files in London that they had just declassified, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, it looks like this is real. And sure enough, it was real. So what they decided to do was, the FBI was completely oblivious to all of this spying. Moran, Sweeney, British. FBI in my narrative stands for fabulous but incompetent. They were entirely asleep. And what Stevenson decided to do was to target the local police commissioner and basically use Sweeney's organization to pressure the local police commissioner to take Moran and the Christian Front off the scene. Now keep in mind, this is all great for us. I mean, we consider this, you know, anti-fascism, but it's all being, you know, they're meeting the national interests of the British, right? So you have to keep that in mind, and it's all illegal. They shouldn't be doing this. And so what they do is the police commissioner, who's a friend of Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of JFK, he's a publicity hound, and he pounces and gets a lot of headlines. And the problem is he detains Moran for peddling literature, which isn't contraband. So he can't arrest him because there's a thing called the First Amendment. And he detains him and has an hour-and-a-half interview with Moran down at the police station, and gets Moran to agree to disband the organization, and that's what he does. The problem is that Moran goes underground and starts a cell structure of the Christian Front, and in many ways the cell structure is more dangerous than the above-ground operation that Moran is running. Because I know from his interview with the police commissioner that he has a shortwave radio in his house, but he says it's only a receiver, and I find that hard to believe that he's not communicating with Scholes. Scholes is now working for the Waffen-SS in Italy under Karl Wolff. So then, this is a sidebar, and I find these memos written by this guy that nobody knows about, John Franklin Carter, who was President Roosevelt's personal intelligence chief. He had his own kind of intelligence wonk who would write foreign policy reports for him and take them to his office. He had direct access to the president. Altogether, he got paid about $600,000 in 1940 money to write these reports, and they were little like 8-page reports. Could you imagine getting paid $1,000 for an 8-page report? That's a great gig. So I find these reports where he's writing memos to Roosevelt, trying to get Moran arrested because Boston police couldn't arrest him, and Franklin is writing to the president about Moran. This is he goes to visit his Moran's local congressman, John W. McCormick, who later becomes Speaker of the House, to try to get Moran arrested and taken off the scene. And one of my questions was, this dude is a foreign policy guy. What's he interested in the Christian Front for? And sure enough, what happens is that they want Moran taken off because he is not who he thinks he is. Professor Coyne from Indiana University wrote about 10 years ago very strong indications that John Franklin Carter is actually a controlled agent of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. And because Russians were losing on the battlefield in the spring of 1940, the Russians had an interest in getting the Christian Front taken down in the United States. And so So he's a communist spy. There they are. So when you got Nazis, commies, and James Bond in Boston, I was like, I think I have a book. So, oh gosh, sorry. Let me see here. Yeah. So what happens is, in the fall of 1943, because the Christian Front has been dissolved, Moran conducts an operation of gang warfare with anti-Semitized Catholics beating up Jews in Boston and creating riots. The other historians have written about this, but my research into U.S. Army counterintelligence files indicates that the violence started much earlier, and that the Jewish community in Boston was split about the publicity about the violence because they wanted to be perceived in the city as good Americans and not even associated whatsoever with violence. The Catholics had the same sort of attitude as an immigrant church. So you get these anxieties within the Jewish community. But there were riots breaking out in the spring and summer and fall of 1943, all throughout Boston, Catholics beating up on Jews. So then what happens to Scholz? He ends up in Italy as aide-de-camp to Karl Wolff, the head Nazi of the Waffen-SS in Italy. He's tracked down by U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps in 1945, in the spring of 1945. He's found in a spa in the Alps. He's got a silver spoon existence. U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps takes him in and interrogates him, puts him into what's a former concentration camp in Germany, where he cools his heels. Then, all of a sudden, what happens is that the guy who's on the cover of the book, he's in a Conestoga wagon giving a political speech. His name is Joseph E. McWilliams, a member of the Christian Front. His nickname by Walter Winchell was Joe McNazi. Well, Joe McNazi goes on trial in Washington for sedition. And the prosecutor of the Joe McNazi case hears that Scholz has been arrested in Germany, gets a stay by the judge to travel to Germany and interview Scholz in the concentration camp, now run by the Americans, so in detention. So the prosecutor goes to Germany, interviews Scholz, and goes back to Washington, where he unsuccessfully prosecutes the case. In the meantime, Scholz goes to the U.S. Army and says, I've been cleared of any wrongdoing, please let me go. And they said, what do you mean? They said, well, I just gave a couple days of interviews with the special prosecutor from the United States Justice Department, and he gave me a clean bill of health. So the commandant of the camp talks to the guards and says, did that happen? They say, well, the DOJ guy left and didn't take him with him. So Scholz manipulates the U.S. Army into a clean bill of health, and he gets set free. So in his pocket, he carries with him a letter of recommendation from Cardinal Fossati, a character reference from the Cardinal Archbishop of Turin, where he was assigned with Karl Wolff. And apparently, if you read this, and Richard Brightman, who's at American University, helped me get access to this. I otherwise would not have been able to do it because it was in the, you had to have special clearance to get access to those documents. So he takes a boat and goes off to Bolivia and has a 6-month affair with the ex-wife of the fashion designer Oleg Cassini, if that name means anything to you, and then moves to Cochabamba and settles there until the late 1950s. I was interested into why why he was released and what he did after the war. And so I asked the FBI for a special, to get his file released. I was able to get his file released in 2017, early 2018. And I was very interested in what his life was like after the war. And this is the information I received. This is from the 1945 period. So this is talking about redaction, right? So it's what the FBI doesn't want you to see. So that kind of gets my hackles up. I have a hunch about what he was doing. Oh, and there's more, right? This is, again, your tax dollars at work. This is Freedom of Information Act, right? So even more, you know, I guess formerly secret. That's hilarious, isn't it? Secret crossed out, then nothing left, right? So then this is a note. I use Microsoft Paint. So it looks like this dude I've been able to track down. He gets passport. He's a passport dude. So I think they may have made up a false passport for him. That's the only thing I can get out of this. But I think that's kind of hilarious. And then this is another page, right? So that's the Freedom of Information Act for you. It keeps going. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And then this is for historians. This is the kind of historiography I'm looking at. And it's about the story that I heard in grad school, that the 1930s was when American Catholics finally made it and assimilated into American life, and that they became members of the Roosevelt cabinet, and you could see a view down the horizon to the election of a Catholic president. And my story says that's all not exactly symmetric, and that's why it kind of juggles up the historiography a bit. Seymour Martin Lipset says that, you know, he was at Harvard through the 1990s, and he says that the right's kind of ephemeral. It kind of goes in fits and starts, and that's because, in his view, the right doesn't engage in electoral politics. And my book says they may not engage in electoral politics, but the ideas and the theologies remain, and they shouldn't be overlooked. Oh, gosh. There's this whole thing about the FBI as chummy with Catholics. There are a couple books written on Catholics in the FBI and how the FBI was kind of becoming a Catholic enclave in the 1930s. I don't think that works. The soft power argument from Nye. And then the historiography of forgetting. A lot of people in Boston and New York come to me and say, why is it we never knew about this? How could we not know about this? And I said, well, they're spies. Like, you're not supposed to know about what they do. And for 80 years, they've been covering their tracks. And that's a big part of why we don't know about what they do. Also, remembering and forgetting, this is another piece. FBI, when they were in the cell structure, the FBI recruited an informant it was a woman, informant T1. And Hoover, FBI Director Hoover said, you know, would you be willing to go on the stand and testify against these members of the Christian Front? And she said no, out of fear for her life. So they couldn't really get a conviction. And we still don't know who informant T1 is. I know that she's a woman. She worked at the Catholic Information Center in downtown Boston, and she had an auxiliary job at the Charlestown Naval Yard. She spoke fluent German. That's all I know. We just don't know who a lot of these people are because it's still locked out. Historiographical issues that I ran into. I started this project 10 years ago. And if you were writing on the right wing 10 years ago, you were looked at with suspicion because A, academics didn't want to give credibility to the right, and B, they thought you might be a right-winger yourself trying to glorify the right wing. I just saw these people as really interesting, but nobody wanted to publish my book. First publisher turned it down. When I got the FBI file for the New York front, basically this is how the book worked. I got the FBI file released that nobody thought existed. It was about the New York case. I put it to a book proposal. The publisher came back, said no, again, because nothing happened. No bombs went off. They didn't fire any bullets. That's when I started, A, praying, and because I had to get my job, right? Because I needed a book for a 10-year track. And then B, I started researching Boston. And I basically decided, well, I'll write an article about the Christian Front in Boston. So I went to Google Books, typed in the name of Francis P. Moran, who I knew from the newspaper clippings was a leader. Nobody had written anything about it. A snippet came up from a book published in 1960 saying that Francis Moran had met secretly with Scholz when he was consul in Boston and started spying for the Nazis. And I just sat back in my chair in my office and go, well, that's pretty interesting. Wonder why nobody's written about that. So that's what I decided to write about. And sure enough, I put the New York piece and the Boston piece together, and a lot of spy stuff and the whole thing. Then there was the whole thing, this goes back full circle, the professor who first said, and when I walked in his office, he said, you can't write a 10-page paper because there's nothing to see here, folks. But as I said, I used to be a cop, so I used to say there's nothing to see here, folks, all the time. This is about Moran, you know, kind of, again, finishing on this grim note. He wants to, by 1943, he's talking about exterminationism of Jews. This is in America in 1943, prior to the opening of the camps. So it's very, very grim tale. Oh, I think we saw this before. This is where I'm going in the future. I think, so Steve Bannon has Jesus now, and also Mary. And I'm interested in that because my people had Jesus and Mary as well. And I think Steve Bannon is the most full-throated anti-communist, kind of in the public sphere. So I'm interested in what he's doing with that imagery. So that's where I'm going in the future for probably an article right now. Oh, shoot. Well, I think we can leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Gallagher,
Thank
for
you.
your presentation and exploring this remarkable chapter in history. We have a few minutes for questions from anyone in the audience regarding the book or regarding this research before we resume for our third session of hands.
So, Father, I saw in one of the PowerPoints it said that Scholz recruited a guy named William Kolpa. Would you happen to maybe have the source for that? I've run into Kolpa on some of the assignments.
Yeah, so Kolpa has written an autobiography that was published independently, I think about 2 years ago. I think he's deceased, but it was published posthumously. You wouldn't find it in a word search because he misspells Scholz's name. He refers to him as Scholz. I can definitely get you the source on that. Kolpa is an MIT student who's kind of in the Naval Reserves, and he's studying engineering at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Part of Scholz's spycraft was that people would come to him who were who offered to spy for him. In fact, George Johnson Armstrong is a British communist who did that when he was sailing through Boston. And he was ultimately the first British subject executed under the Treachery Act back in London. And he was a Scholz recruit. Kolpa was in the Naval Reserves, and what Scholz always wanted his recruits to do was not to leave their military postings to do spy work for him, but he always encouraged them to stay in the U.S. military, and that he would work with them through the German consulate systems in Europe. And Kolpa specifically said, stay in the U.S. Navy. When you get to Europe, jump ship, go to your nearest German consulate, basically tell them that you know me. And Kolpa, that's why Kolpa was taken to Anschule Westen, which is in Park Zorglit in The Hague, which was a Nazi SS spy school, and trained to be a spy, and then offloaded in 1944 off the coast of Maine from a German submarine. Really interesting case. I'd be happy to talk with you about that. Sure. Right.
And I'm wondering if we're seeing some similarities in this case versus what was happening to some of those scientists in the college.
Yeah, so that's interesting too. I've been thinking about that as well. Scholz isn't a science and tech guy. So you want to hear my wild, crazy hunch? And because it's that redacted, I'm saying, what the heck? So these are my parallels. I think that at the time I asked for that file to be declassified, and this is what happened to me. When I saw what they had done, I went back to the declassification unit of the National Archives, and I said, is there any way I can see this? And they said to me, you can, but you won't be able to see this before your book is published. So they kind of played hardball with me. They're like, you're either going to have to wait out, you can't wait out editors. Like, they basically knew that because it's part of it's our profession to be historians. We can't just wait around for the government to let us see things, because you got to get on with your profession. So they played hardball with me on that, and I said, all right, so basically I'm going to give you my hunch, which doesn't make the US government look great, even though it's a hunch. I think that he ends up in Cochabamba, which is where Klaus Barbie, the Butcher Leon, also lives. And I can't imagine that they didn't know one another. At the same time, in 2017, Jared Kushner was pushing the Abraham Accords. My view is that if the Israelis found out that the Americans had the scoop on Barbie, 15 years before Barbie was extricated by the Mossad, they would have been ticked off, and they didn't want that to happen. That's just my wild, crazy hunch. But the thing is, if they're not going to show me the evidence, I'm going to make a wild, crazy hunch. And it's all based on parallels. So, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Even though the funding and the familial support was there.
Right.
So, like, immigrants would, like, qualify, but there was senators, and I'll keep that name to myself,
Yeah.
that would block it over and over again.
Right. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of writing on kind of anti-Semitism within the State Department during the 1930s. I think that's pretty real. And I think that has a large part of it. With these folks, immigration is a big issue for them. And they are very much anti-immigration. And it's basically immigration of Jews. They don't get into the elite structures of the government. They get into the local police departments, and they get into the National Guard units. So that's why after the January 6th insurrection, when the newspapers started saying that we're going to do investigations in the National Guard, it was almost like deja vu, because I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. Yeah, so that's where they go. Yeah, sure.
I've been reading, I think it's Hitler's American Friends.
Right.
And he was talking about Senator Lundin from Minnesota.
Yeah.
He actually had a Nazi propaganda man writing his speeches and stuff for him. I don't know if Schultz had anything to do with Lundin or...
Yeah, so Lundin shows up in my book, and so he was at basically he was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he actually went to the Bethesda testing grounds and shot the Johnson automatic rifle. My view is he gave the specs to the German embassy in Washington. This is Minnesota, he's from Minnesota. Lundin is a Minnesota senator who was basically also recruited by the German embassy and supplying info to them. I think he gave the specs to the Johnson rifle to the German embassy, and that's why the Germans got so jazzed up about having the U.S. adopt the Johnson rifle. Lundin, by the way, at the testing grounds, he hit full bullseyes with 10 shots, both the Garand and the Johnson semi-automatic. So he was a good shot, actually. Just to decide. Oh, sure.
So I know, for example, like Bishop Fulton Sheen, he was involved with people like Elizabeth Bentley who were involved in espionage.
Right.
Do you see any sort of correlation or involvement with Bishop Sheen, perhaps with the Christian Front movement, or is he a separate entity?
Yeah, so these are really good questions. Bishop Sheen is a little bit too mainstream to dirty his fingertips with Father Coughlin. So the official answer to your question is no. I don't see any hookup with Sheen and any of my wackos or spies. So, yes.
thank you, Father Gallagher,
Thank you.
for exploring spycraft intrigue and everything else.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll be beginning our third and final panels for today at 1:30. And after that session at 3 o'clock, we'll be meeting in the Gaston Science Building, the auditorium. It is the building furthest down that we call Abbey Lane here.